So welcome back, everyone. I think the previous session has revealed quite a bit of interest in the role of municipalities in resilience financing. And so welcome back, everybody. This is, we're timely here now with our session on financing resilient cities, fiscal risks or engines of growth. My name is Gundula Löffler. I am a research fellow at the Development and Public Finance Program here at ODI Global. And I primarily work on issues around intergovernmental fiscal relations and urban finance. So cities around the world are on the front lines of some of the most pressing global challenges. They are home to over half of the world's population, and this share is growing rapidly, in particular in lower middle income countries. By 2050, we expect almost 7 out of 10 people on this planet to live in cities. And while we generally view cities as being hubs of economic growth and innovation, and with the right policies and investments, they can certainly be, they are also highly vulnerable to climate change, to natural disasters, demographic pressures, and simply to the stresses of aging and inadequate infrastructure. So cities are growing, and their infrastructure needs to grow with them. Infrastructure that provides urban populations with basic necessities such as safe housing, reliable transportation, clean water, energy, waste management systems, but also attracts business and promotes local economic development and strengthens resilience to climate risks such as flooding, extreme heat, storms, rising sea levels, you name it. So because resilient infrastructure, without resilient infrastructure, cities risk facing scaling social, economic, and environmental costs. This is why financing urban resilience is not a luxury, it is an urgent necessity. Investing in resilient infrastructure not only protects city dwellers from shocks and stresses, but also generates long-term economic, social, and environmental benefits. However, global estimates suggest that the investment gap runs into trillions of dollars annually. Meeting these needs requires innovative approaches to financing, partnerships, and governance. Local and city governments are central to this agenda. They're closest to citizens, they understand the risks and needs of their communities, and they are often directly responsible for urban planning, for service delivery, and infrastructure provision. So while the national government and international institutions set frameworks and provide many of the resources, it is at the city level where resilience is designed, implemented, and felt in people's daily lives. Therefore, empowering municipalities with the financial tools, technical capacity, and partnerships they need is critical to achieving sustainable, inclusive, and resilient urban futures. This is a position that is starting to be widely accepted and supported. For example, the fourth Financing for Development outcome document clearly acknowledges the crucial role of subnational governments and commits to strengthening subnational finance through diversifying revenue and promoting access to external financing sources. So let's talk about how this can be achieved. To do this, we will discuss today the kinds of investments that are necessary for cities to boost resilience and foster inclusive, sustainable development. We will examine the different financing options for cities, assess how viable and suitable they are in different contexts, and what the levers are for increasing both the demand and the supply side. More specifically, our discussion will be organized around 3 broad questions. 1, why is accessing investment financing so challenging for cities, and what can we learn from those cities that have managed to do so? 2, what effective models for external financing exist and how can they be taken to scale? And 3, what can central governments do to facilitate city financing from external financiers? To explore these questions, I'm joined by a great selection of speakers today. We have here on my very left, Astrid Haas. Astrid is an independent feminist urban economist working across research and practice. She's also a research associate with ODI Global, as well as with the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, and a fellow at the Africa Urban Lab of the African School of Economics. Welcome, Astrid. Then we have Manja Karkbo. Manja is the head of the delivery unit a team established specifically to drive innovation and delivery at Freetown City Council. She's also an Earthshot Fellow and a Yale Emerging Climate Leader Fellow, and has more than 20 years of combined experience in strategy, operations, and project management. Then we have Lynn O'Grady. Lynn is Deputy Head of the EBRD Sustainable Infrastructure Group, where she leads the Green Cities program. Lynn has 4 decades of international experience in infrastructure finance, and she's also part of the ODI family as being a former ODI fellow in Eswatini. And last but not least, we have Kebu Piri. Kebu is a project preparation specialist in the Project Development Support Unit of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, DBSA. She is a chartered accountant by profession and brings extensive experience in infrastructure advisory and consulting. Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for being here today with me. So to kick us off, I would like to invite Astrid to give us an overview of the challenges that many cities experience in accessing external financing for investment and what cities can do to overcome some of those challenges. Astrid, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be the first speaker on this extremely distinguished panel of people who I look up to, so it's very nice to be able to share the panel with them today. I'm going to be presenting some research to get us into the discussion. It's based actually on research that I've done for the African Development Bank, and also together with ODI. I will show the publications at the end, they're publicly accessible. That look at the demand and the supply side factors that affect how cities access finance. This will focus on Africa, just because this is where the research was done and also where most of my work is grounded. However, a lot of the lessons are similar for many LMICs, cities across the globe. But I want to be clear from the outset, my role here is not to depress you, like yesterday, but rather is really truly to set the stage for these 3 speakers. Because what this panel of incredible women are doing in the respective spaces that they work in are actually tackling the problems that I'm going to be presenting to you, and doing so successfully. So the message I want to get across today is financing cities is not an insurmountable challenge by any means. And in fact, we have a lot of success stories represented here today, but it requires the will and the collective effort, particularly from national governments, but even beyond, and I'll speak as well a little bit to the question I asked yesterday around MDBs and IFIs, to be able to rethink how we tackle these issues to solve, as Gundula very clearly put it, one of the biggest forces of our times that could shape, or that is already shaping the global economy. So I'm going to set the stage with a diagnosis. Josue very kindly gave us a sort of framework of 3 in the last panel. I'm going to expand that framework a little bit. And I'm going to sort of look, I'm an economist by training, so we do demand and supply. So I'm going to sort of try and look at this issue from the demand and supply side. So where we started with the African Development Bank research was to say, what's actually preventing cities in Africa from getting finance, right? You'll ask any city here. Fola very, very clearly put it as in her question in the last panel. You know, cities are like, we need the finance. We have so many investments that are needed. So why is there no finance flowing to cities? So together with some co-authors, we unpacked this into a demand and a supply side. And I'm just going to quickly take you through the different factors we came up with. But again, if you're interested, this is much more clearly elaborated in the AFDB publication. So on the demand side, we start with the legislative, right? So the enabling environment. Now, there's a common trope in Africa. Cities are actually not allowed to borrow. So I went back and I looked for all the legislation that I could, which was painful because I'm an economist and not a lawyer. Definitely not a lawyer in very many different traditions, but this is what I did. I found 41 countries' legislations of the 54 on the African continent. And I looked simply to say, do they allow subnational borrowing or not? And actually, 32 did, right? So that was actually a surprising finding, because often at the time it's like, well, the law doesn't actually allow you to borrow. So then I said, okay, well, if they allowed borrowing, how many have actually borrowed? And we got to about 16, this is at a country level, in about 16 of the countries, subnational borrowing has happened. at some point in the past, but not very recently. And often a time when subnational borrowing has happened, it's been once and never again. So it is, you know, these are aggregate figures that kind of mask the detail, but at least from a legislative perspective, there seemed to be some scope. This is another thing I looked at. In how many of the countries where I could find this, 41 countries I could find the legislation for, did national government have to approve the borrowing? Now, from everyone here who's from the Ministry of Finance, and I know there's quite a few of you, you'll say, well, this is obvious, we need to approve because this goes onto our debt. The problem with this is that many of the cities I work with, including the city that I come from, which is Kampala, Uganda, they are opposition strongholds. So this is often politicized in a way that is not taken into account in the legislation, right? The legislation doesn't take into account the fact that this can be politicized, right? So you have to, amongst the four, obviously one of them is South Africa. South Africa has the most permissive legislation on the continent for municipal borrowing. That stems from a constitutional factor where they see the three spheres of government as separate but equal. Okay. So now we looked at the legislative, and the legislative was not as unpermissive as we had assumed. So we looked at what we call creditworthiness. And creditworthiness is, you know, how financially healthy is the city? How likely is it to pay back if it borrows, right? And we looked at whether they have authorities to set fiscal rules, whether they have their own budget and accounting, their expenditure management, and access to sufficient streams of revenues. And in full disclosure, this is where most of our cities on the continent fail, right? They have a lot of work to do in their own house, right? So in their own, and this is from the subnational, from the OECD UCLG's work on subnational finance guidelines. You know, in Africa, tax revenue as a share of subnational government revenue is still relatively small compared to other places in the world. So there is scope to increase this. And if we want to look at this in even a per capita level, right? This is, okay, Africa is not represented here as a region, this is in income countries, but you see in most low income countries, they only raise about $12 per capita in own source revenue. And for a continent that hasn't yet fully undergone its demographic transition, that number is actually getting lower because we're not raising revenue fast enough to cover all the needs for the growing population, okay? And so this is another city that I do a lot of work in, or county, Kisumu County. So again, you'll see some data because I want to just make this point. Again, this is illustrative, but very illustrative of a lot of cities I work in. But in Kisumu, we looked at, and this I think is from, I know it's from Kenya, but I think Kisumu, Kenya, sorry. In 2019, we looked at what they actually collected in own source revenue and what the potential was given all their legislative ability to collect own source revenue. And why Kenya? Because Kenya in 2010, went through a devolution that actually improved, like again, from a legislative perspective, they can raise a lot more than they're raising. And the big jump here, the 425%, a lot of that is, to Antoinette's point yesterday, the potential of property tax, right? The potential to raise property tax. Again, in most cities I work in, this is the highest potential. Now, Peter asked me whether I'd be talking about property tax, and the reason I'm not going to go into this in detail is because actually on the panel, we have the absolute expert in property tax, Manja, because her city, not only in Africa, but globally, has gone through the most impressive property tax reform that we have seen to date in recent history. Freetown, Sierra Leone. And so I leave Manja to actually tell that story because she actually lived it. But spoiler alert, just to show how you can jump that, they managed to raise their revenues, their own source revenues sevenfold, or their property tax revenues sevenfold, right? So this is not hypothetical numbers. This is if you can get your administration correct, you can do this. But we've been now talking about relatively bigger cities. This is data from Uganda, from our newly created cities in 2020, which are much smaller and actually more emblematic of most cities we have on the continent. Most of the fastest growing cities on the continent are not the biggest cities, they're intermediary cities. And they're much more reliant on intergovernmental fiscal transfers in their budget. So you'll see here 80% and above, sometimes 90%. Again, data from Uganda, but really illustrative of a lot of cities that I work for, right? So It's a very important, and I'll come back to the intergovernmental fiscal transfer, but I think it's very important that we remember this because often when we do work in this area, everyone thinks about own source revenues, but actually this is the majority of most cities' budgets. Okay, the third thing we looked at is like, okay, if they could get their financial health in order, and if now they have the legislative capacity, what do they actually want investments for? And this is another big hole. Many cities don't actually know what they want the money for. Or they say what they want it for, but it will last for one mayoral term, for which no investor is going to invest that money in. So credible long-term pipelines. Now, I picked the city of Kinshasa. It happens to be the one that we looked in detail. And in the AFDB report, there's annexes of some of the cities we looked in detail. So you can find the Kisumu data, the Kinshasa data there. Kinshasa is already got a population of 17 million and growing. It does not have an investment plan. So even if Kinshasa was to be able to get its house in order in terms of its creditworthiness, it wouldn't even be clear where the investments needed to go to, right? So there's the pipeline issue. And then this is a factor I really want to point out because we overlook this so much. Cities don't actually spend the money they already have, right? Everyone's asking for more money and more money and more money. But so this is Kisumu again. This is just from their audited accounts. In fiscal year 2021-2022, they only realized 32% of their capital budget that they already had. So this is transfers they already had in their account. And these are things like outdated procurement systems. These are things that don't make very glossy covers, but are incredibly important when it comes to actually being able to think about public financial management at a local level. Okay, so I've talked about the city level. And again, I think many of us who work on cities in Africa will agree this is a problem, and we're working to resolve this problem. It's not an insurmountable problem. As I said, we have Manja here who can speak about Freetown's experience in that space. But then we asked ourselves, okay, cities clean up their house. Will finance flow to cities, right? So if we are doing all the work we do and we do it really well, will cities be able to get finance? So we looked at the supply side factors. Now, it's really important for cities. If cities are going to borrow, there's a big difference between national borrowing and subnational borrowing. They need to borrow in local currency. Cities' revenues are generated in local currency, and they do not have any of the instruments that national governments have to hedge against foreign currency risk, right? So where are they going to get local currency from? Well, local currency markets. And those, unfortunately, across the continent are very underdeveloped, right? This is a map of market capitalization of stock exchanges, but essentially it's just an illustration of the shallowness of most capital markets, of most domestic financing markets, right? So even if cities were now to clean up shop, where is that local currency financing going to come from, right? So there needs to be work here on the financial sector. And then there's the ratings. The ratings were brought up by Josue in the last panel. We looked at this for cities. These are the cities we could find ratings for, and Fola mentioned that Lagos has a Fitch rating too. We didn't add, Fitch should be there. Most of these cities have only been rated once and never again. Aside from South Africa and Nigeria, every other city on this list has only ever had one rating and never again, right? And then on top of it, and this is a paper that I have hopefully coming out soon, I looked at municipal credit ratings in a lot more detail, but there is a study from UNDP that came out, I think in 2023, that shows there's already an Africa bias at a national rating level. And I know this is debatable, but if you think about this at a national rating level, all of that is going to flow down to a municipal level because municipal ratings are based on national ratings, right? And so the question is, would the signal to the market even be there? But we're not even giving a signal to the market because most cities don't even have a credit rating or an up-to-date credit rating. Then comes to my question yesterday, which maybe I didn't formulate well enough yesterday, although I think a lot of people who work on cities came to me and said, oh, we understood your question. So I want to just explain a little bit what I was meaning yesterday. I have no doubt that IFIs, MDBs, the AFDB does a lot of work on cities. And they write a lot about cities, and they understand that cities are the locus of productivity, the locus of where they're going to generate revenue. They want to invest in them. However, Josue mentioned it in the panel before, the structures do not allow them to work directly with cities. And here's the example from the AFDB. Again, you can find this full analysis in the report. The AFDB issued subnational finance guidelines in 2019. It said in those guidelines, the AFDB now wants to go and it wants to lend to subnational governments. We analyzed and the first lending they did was just now in June 2025 to the city of Johannesburg. Now we did an analysis of those guidelines, and we looked at all the criteria they give. And once you go through all of those criteria and you figure out how many cities, it's less than 5 that would even qualify to be able to borrow. Lagos is not one of them, right? Neither is Freetown. And so they've made it so restrictive that the only cities that they can lend to are ones that can actually go to the capital market themselves, right? So you have to be very careful that you're not crowding out the finance, right? So even though they say they want to do this, they made it so restrictive that they're not able to do it. However, on the panel, we have the example of the regional development bank that is most advanced in this space, which is the EBRD, and I look forward to Lynn's comments on that, closely followed by the Inter-American Development Bank, who've done big strides in this area too, okay? But the African Development Bank is far behind. And then finally, the climate finance piece, right? It was mentioned in the last panel, 70% of climate finance is loans. I've just told you all the reasons that it's difficult for cities to get loans. But also, very little climate finance is flowing to Africa. And of that, 40% is going to 5 countries. So you can imagine the trickle that is reaching cities, right? So I sit in a lot of workshops where everyone's like, climate finance is the solution for cities. Well, it's not, because actually, again, you have a systemic issue where the finance wouldn't flow to cities. Oops, sorry. So just a little bit on the solutions, but then I'll leave that for the rest of the experts on the panel to talk to. So first of all, intergovernmental fiscal transfers. I want to make the point, having a large share of intergovernmental fiscal transfers as part of your overall subnational budget is not an Africa-specific thing. Everyone was like, African cities need to raise their own source revenue and need to survive on own source revenue. Actually, cities across the globe don't do that. There's a large role for intergovernmental fiscal transfers because national governments have much better revenue raising capabilities, right? But the point of transfers that we make is they need to become more predictable and they need to become more stable. Here I appeal to people from the Ministry of Finance who manage these transfers. They're very unpredictable and very uncertain in many cases. If you can make them more predictable and certain, they can be borrowed against. And we use a case study of Mexico in the AFDB report where they did this, but and David may be able to speak more of this. Nigeria is a place on the continent that's trying to figure out how you can actually do that, right? So improve how your intergovernmental fiscal transfer system works. Secondly, creditworthiness of cities, right? This is just the case of Dakar. Now, Dakar did so many targeted PFM reforms because they actually wanted to float a bond. In the end, they didn't float a bond, politics. However, because of those PFM reforms, they were able to actually get other loans, right? So the idea is if you can then actually get your house in order, right, you're actually able to borrow. The third thing is your pipeline, like actually have a long-term pipeline. And here, really one of the standout on the continent is Cape Town, where their borrowing is driven by 3 criteria, right? Will the investment expand the revenue base? Does it cut costs? Or does it support economic growth? If it doesn't do those things, then they won't take the money, right? And this is one of the very few cities on the continent that makes very targeted decisions about where it's going to actually invest its borrowed resources. And the final thing, and this goes to work I did with Gundula and speaks to Kebu, the final panelist's role, which is this local currency financing question is going to be unlocked by our national development banks in our countries. I was excited to hear from a representative from my country yesterday to say that the Ugandan Development Bank has been recapitalized, which is great, but that's where local currency financing can come in and help cities. So we really need to work with strengthening these institutions. So finally, I just want to say, these are the two papers that I've been quoting this data from. But I just want to say municipal finance is a system, right? And this is what we showed with this demand and supply side analysis. We can't expect to just work on one of these pieces and everything else to work. It requires a systemic approach. And we need to be able to do this if we want to have the success of cities to be able to raise finance. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Astrid, for these insights into the challenges that cities face in borrowing and accessing investment finance, but also pointing out some of the opportunities and the progress that has been made in this regard, in particular on the African continent. However, what does the situation look like in other regions? So I want to ask a question to Lynn. EBRD's Green Cities program works primarily in cities in Eastern and Southeastern Europe and Central Asia. So from your experience working in this region, which of Astrid's points describing the African context resonate in particular with you?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gundula. And, first of all, thank you, Frederic, Gundula, and ODI for extending this invitation to me. I am, as Gundula said, a former ODI fellow, and I was walking to the station this morning and I was just reflecting, I would have been interviewing for ODI 40 years ago because I went to Swaziland in 1986. My interview was terrible, but I think they must have seen something in me and I got in. And honestly, it has transformed my career. I would have been heading for super average and I went, high end. So I just want to use this opportunity to big shout out to ODI. So back to business. I think, and thank you, Astrid, for that presentation. I think my main comment is that the region that EBRD works in, which is, as Gundula says, is Central Eastern Europe, Central Asia. We're now moving more into ODI regions. So we're presently active in North Africa, and we have just moved into Sub-Saharan Africa. But I think all those issues that you raise, it's no different. So sort of what resonated with me, you've got the politics, you've got the fact that in many of our countries, the mayors are opposition. And the minute, even if you're doing subnational lending, the government is involved at some level in that decision-making process, even if it's just a nod. So, that is clear. This lack of, creditworthiness, bankable projects, inadequate pipelines, perhaps not so much, but it's definitely there. And finally, this legal and regulatory environment. So that's sort of big picture. It's no different. I think we have done some analysis of Sub-Saharan Africa. I think it is more centralized. I think those opportunities for subnational, as EBRD moves in there, they are going to be harder to find. So I think that's all I can say to Astrid's excellent presentation. I could go into some case studies, Gundula, or I'm going to talk in more detail about green cities. I don't know, would you like me to just do one case study of how we...
I mean, yeah, if you would briefly want to speak to maybe just sort of one good example where similar to, how Astrid mentioned Dakar or Cape Town, if you can think of that one city that's where you think they have really done a good job at accessing.
I think what I will do is talk about this enabling environment and then this all-important blended finance that came up in the previous panel, and I'm sure it was a key theme yesterday. So for subnational lending to take place, there needs to be the correct legal and regulatory environment that Astrid talked about. So an example of where this has currently happened and it's opening up access to finance is in Morocco. So Morocco, they have now implemented fiscal decentralization at a regional level. So what this has done is this has allowed EBRD for the first time to lend to the region. So we are lending to the region of Gelmim in southern Morocco for a resilience project to improve the water supply. Obviously, water security, huge problem in Morocco and that region. So you've got that legislation that was required for the enabling environment. Then that project would not have been possible without blended finance. And there is so it's there's the EBRD loan, so subnational, we are pricing our loan at market, but we have to bring the cost down. Otherwise, Gelman, they would not be able to afford it, basically. So it's blended with a grant from the global investment facility, environmental facility, and also there is a guarantee from the EU. We're finding that guarantees are much more prevalent. So, and then just in this all-important enabling environment, this is something that EBRD, you know, back in the day, sort of 1994, when the municipal program started, has done very well. And we worked on supporting the enabling environment. So to pick one standout country, it's Romania. So EBRD started lending there at a sovereign level. Then the funds were on lent to the city. But we worked with the national government to support them in the legislation for decentralization, and we work with the cities. And now, 20 years on, we are now lending to municipal companies on a corporate basis. Some of those transactions, the bank doesn't even require security, nothing. So in 20 years, EBRD's gone from lending to the government to lending to a company without recourse to the sovereign. And I think just thinking about this sub-Saharan Africa, where EBRD, we need to find our additionality. This is a transition that we will be able to support in that region.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Yeah, so clearly, while there might be some like marginal differences between different regions, but it seems that some of the challenges that cities face can be found across different regions. And also, thanks for pointing out the important role of the enabling environment at the national level for cities. And we will actually return to this point a little bit later in our discussion. Now I would like to take a deep dive into the experience of one city in Africa that has actually been doing quite well at attracting external support and investment financing to build resilient infrastructure. So Manja, can you paint us a picture of your experience in Freetown? Where has the city been successful in attracting financing for investment? And from your point of view, what are the key factors that sort of contributed to that success?
Okay, thanks. I want to just kind of contextualize things a little bit. Freetown City in the west coast of Africa, 1.2 million population, experiencing rapid growth due to rural to urban migration. 35% of our residents live in informality. The current mayor, Yvonne Sawyer, was elected in 2018, re-elected for a second and final term in 2023. I've been with her through her entire mayoral journey. And there are just a few things that we've done that kind of just set us apart, I think, from the onset. The first is we have a plan. We had a plan for the first term and we have a plan for the second term. Our second term plan is called Transform Freetown, Transforming Lives. One overarching goal, it is to create 120,000 jobs for women and young people by 2028. And we really developed that plan after engagement with residents. We had a 1-month session in communities. What are your priorities? What do you want to see? What are your real needs that you want to see us address? Following the month-long consultation, we actually had planning labs with development partners, with technical experts, government agencies, to say, this is what Freetonians want, this is what our residents want. How do we now put this into a framework, set targets so that we can deliver on that? It was really important that we had these people there, because we needed to make sure that we had a very inclusive plan. The development partners were in the room when we were agreeing on city priorities. It meant that when they were doing their budgeting, they could include our priorities as part of their budgeting. That was very deliberate on our part. It was really important there was alignment. Second, if you don't know what you want, they're going to give you what they want to give you. And we know what we want, and we are going to get what we want, not what you want to give us. And it's important that we had the plan, and that helped us to do that. Lastly, we do reporting. We have to be accountable. Partners, people who are going to give you money, want to know where their money is going, want to understand, are you monitoring? Are you getting a bang for your buck? It's really important. So we do reports every year that we put on we print out and hand out publicly, and we also put on our website, because we need to make sure that we're accountable and that we're transparent. And this has really been a hallmark of Yvonne Akisoya's administration, and it really has helped us. So the leadership, the vision, the plan is what really kind of set the groundwork for us. We came into office, she was a novice, never been a politician, only joined a political party 10 months to elections. She just wanted to do good. And then we're now in there. We need to provide services. The residents have told us what they want. We need money. Okay, let's figure out where we're getting the money from. We go to the revenue department, show us where we're getting the money from. It's a ledger, a blue ledger, handwritten, 30,000 properties for a city of 1.2 million people. So that's what we met. So immediately, we knew that we needed to do something. So we introduced a municipal owned source property tax system, which is called a MOP tax system, which literally revolutionized the way we did things in Freetown. We went from 30,000 households to over 100,000 households. We increased collection efficiency with digitized property records. We were able to improve transparency and linked revenue to visible service delivery. And this was funded by FCDO. Again, FCDO were actually in the room when we were talking about our priorities. So they knew this is something that we wanted to do. So it was really important that we had them there from the onset. What this system really did was it applied a progressive points-based formula to assign values, ensuring that high-value properties pay more while maintaining fairness for lower income residents. It also integrated digital billing, direct payments to banks, and GIS mapping, which improve compliance and reduce leakages. It also links payments to the city's financial management system, so it's updated in real time. I remember there was one point we were all in these WhatsApp groups, and you just get so you literally see when payments were coming in. And it was really exciting at that time, and it was really new for us, and we were able to increase sevenfold our own source revenue. But there's something that Ashley talked about, which is we are getting paid in leons. At the time when we did this, the leons was about 8,500 to the dollar. Now it's 24,000. So a lot of progress, but not really. So these are some of the issues that we're grappling with at city level. So we're pushing, we're trying, but there are limitations. Another thing that Ashford also spoke about that also was crucial for this is there was a lot of resistance from the national government. We're not sure why up till now, but they stopped us from collecting tax for a year. And I remember so vividly, I was sitting in my house and I'm watching TV, and like on CNN, it scrolls and it says the Ministry of Local Government prohibits residents of Freetown to pay their property tax. Yes, this is a true story. It happened. But now we have the same property tax system being rolled out in 4 other cities in Sierra Leone. So we count it as a success and are very, very proud of that. Some of the other things that we've done in terms of examples, we started this program called Freetown the Tree Town. Again, we wanted to increase vegetation coverage in our city. We had a target, plant trees. How are we going to plant trees? We don't have any money. We just have an idea. We know it's important. We knew that there was flooding, there were landslides. All of this was happening as a result of the trees being cut down. So the first thing we did is like, well, let's do something. Let's try and raise our own funding. So the city we did an event. We did an event and we raised $30,000. And that's how we started our Freetown the Tree Town, which is now our flagship adaptation project. With that initial funding, we were able to now go to the World Bank and say, we want to do this in a bigger way. We want to be able to GIS locate our trees so that we're able to plant, track, and grow the tree. That way we're able to have higher rates of higher survival rate and embed community in aspects so that the communities are the ones that are planting the trees. We were able to get that funding. We've planted 1.2 million trees. We are now literally, I would say by the end of this year, we would have finished developing our PDD to go on the carbon market. We have a carbon developer that we've hired at city level, and they're working with us to do that. So again, some of these things as cities, we also need to start. You don't have to have the money, but if someone sees that you're doing something and you can show that this is something that this works, then they will be willing to invest in you. So that's another example from Freetown in terms of what we're doing. This is a cable car. We're very ambitious, as you can tell. We think there's nothing that we can't do in Freetown. 80% of our daily commuters rely on informal public transport. Average speed traffic at peak time is 16 kilometers an hour. 32% of our CO2 is contributed by road traffic. So it's actually a climate issue as well. So we want to do a cable car. To get a feasibility study done, how are we going to fund that? It took over a year asking different organizations, we need funding, we really want to be able to do this. We were finally able to get some funding from the C40 Finance Facility. They gave us $1 million to do a feasibility study, a finance feasibility study, and that feasibility is concluded over a year ago. Following the conclusion of that, we decided that we needed to have a hybrid PPP model to meet the risk appetite of potential investors. We've actually now been going to people, we've been going to road shows, we've been going to cable car conferences, the mayor herself is going, we're visiting, we're engaging, we're speaking to people. And we now have the French government, where Puma is a cable car producer, they've said that the French government have said that they will fund the technology, they will fund the equipment, and that accounts for about 50% of the funding required. But we need a sovereign guarantee. We've gone to the Ministry of Finance. We wrote them a letter 10 months ago, and 2 weeks ago they responded positively. Positively, they said they've asked us to set up an interministerial committee, and we are hopeful. We don't know what that means, but they haven't said no. They have said, let's go ahead. They've said, let's go ahead. So what this really does is that if we're able to push through with this and the national government is able to come on board and support us, it really is a win-win. And we, at city level, we really look at the residents at heart because we are so front-facing. When disasters happen, when anything happens, the mayor, the councillors, they're the first people on ground. So we understand the acute needs and we understand why these things are so important. And so we hope that we're going to be able to convince them with the feasibility study that we have, that this is something that we should be able to do. I'll just give you one more example of something that we're doing. It's something as simple as water. The #1 priority of residents in Freetown is access to water. 40% of them, when we did our engagement, said that's their biggest challenge. So we know that we need to address the water issue. We received some funding from the Peace Building Fund, about $1.4 million, for a Woman for Water for Peace. So we have 25 water kiosks across 5 communities. So we are employing 200 women to manage these kiosks. And this has now become like a catalytic program for us because we built a business model to generate money from selling the water, and Now we've now been able to attract a further $1.1 million from the Swiss Development Corporation to do the same thing in other communities. So again, proving that you get the funding, you do the work, you have proof of concept. So as a city, we act as a catalytic agent, show that things work, and then you get people to be able to support. So for me, those are some of the things that we have been able to do to be able to attract funding. And I think for me, the city's success lies in its we have strong revenue administration. There's a lot of innovation in what we're doing. And we have outcome-driven projects that respond to local needs. But I think there's also just global financing trend. Climate is a big issue right now, and funders will fund climate if you have a really good project. And project that also replicable, replicable. So for me, in we need to build credibility through transparency. We work a lot with communities. We align our resilient projects with the international development and climate priorities, and that's really made us successful in getting access to funding for a lot of what we do. We don't see no, we see, okay, we'll come back later.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Manja. I mean, there's really amazing initiatives going on in Freetown. And I think it also clearly shows that what it requires is continuous entrepreneurial effort and leadership. I mean, you actually said it. I mean, it requires leadership, vision, and a plan, and to have maybe financiers engage as early as possible and have them in the room when you're actually working out the plan so that they can see that it has like proper footing to stand on. Great, thank you for that. But now that we've looked a little bit at the demand side of resilience financing, I want to explore a little bit more the supply side again. So more specifically, the role of the development finance institutions and how they can channel financing directly to cities. So I'm going back to Lynn. My question to you, so to set the scene a little bit, so there exist some development partner programs that lend directly to cities, but they are far and few. Can you give us a brief overview of the reasons why it is generally difficult for bilateral or multilateral development agencies to lend directly to cities for urban investments?
Okay, thank you for the question, and that is truly inspirational, Sierra Leone. What I will do is talk about EBRD's approach and how we have been successful in the urban space. And just to give you some numbers, in terms of our urban lending, about 50% is sovereign, and the remainder 50% is sub-sovereign. So just taking a step back, as it was said about me at the beginning, I lead the Green Cities program at EBRD, and I'm actually not here by myself. I never go anywhere by myself. Pippa's here and Maya's here, just keeping an eye on me, particularly Maya. So how EBRD Green Cities work? It's super simple, but it's effective. So it's got 3 pillars. So the first pillar is the planning. So it's we call them Green City Action Plans. So we work with a city, lots of stakeholder engagement, the community is involved to develop an action plan of green and sustainable investments. That's tick. The second pillar is the all-important investments. So from those Green City Action Plans, there is a list of projects that can be financed, of which EBRD picks up some of them, but anybody can. The city can do them themselves, the local government, other MDBs, which is common practice. And then the third pillar, we're an MDB, so it's that capacity building support for project preparation, support for capacity building for cities, support for project implementation. So, and why Green Cities is so successful is because, and you may think this is stupid, but it's because it connects that planning piece and project preparation piece with investments. Because what I have learned, I've been working in the city space now for 10 years. Prior to that, I was working on transport, much easier. Because the city space, it's so intense. I mean, you must have found this. There's so many players, but these players are not particularly good at connecting with each other. And you will find that there's a lot of feasibility studies, plans going on with no eye on the financing. So we have addressed that. So why has EBRD been successful? So I think, first of all, with the financing, it's all about flexibility. So one size does not fit all. And we are really lucky because EBRD is a regional development bank, but we have public and private under one roof. We have bankers who are able to work on both public and private. It makes a huge difference. And I think it's a real strength of EBRD. So in this sort of adapting to the context, when we go to a centralized country, there is no point banging your head against a brick wall and going to the city and saying, you know, can we, do you want to work with us? We'll, you know, for new buses. There's no point. You have to go to the central level. And trust me, because I made that mistake in Egypt. But so in that circumstances, we would accept the reality. We accept the reality. We work with we lend to the government, but on lend to the city or the utility company. I think what's important to EBRD is our engagement is with the city. That's where we want to be. And I was looking the other day about just at a transaction that we did with Sarajevo Water. And if you look at, I'm just interested in all the different legal agreements because there's so many because of this one size does not fit all. And there we lent to the government in Bosnia, then we on-lent to the water company. But but there is an agreement between the water company and the city, and it's all about getting that water company to commercialize, you know, making sure that they have freedom to set tariffs, making sure that they have a business plan, that they're free to employ good staff. So we'll always have an eye on making that entity capacity building, commercialization, with that end goal being the Romania experience, you know, and actually in Sarajevo now, we are looking at a district heating project, and that will be non-sovereign. So it's sort of, I think, maybe just to sum up, we like to move the dial, and we're able to do that because of EBRD's unique mandate. So that's the sovereign stuff. But actually, interestingly, though, and I talked about Egypt. Egypt is interesting because at one end of the spectrum, you are very much locked into sovereign financing, which is fine. That's how the Egyptians want to do it. I'm all respect to them. But at the other end of the spectrum, you have this private sector, and you can work. I think there was a question about PPPs at the previous session. So we financed, as part of the Green Cities program, the first dry port in Egypt, and now, maybe I'm talking too much, but from the Green City Action Plan in 6th of October, which is to the west of Cairo, we have a project coming out of that, which is a PPP for a wastewater treatment plant. So, you know, it's very diverse. You've got public sector, but you can also work with the private sector. So, but where EBRD is good, it's the subnational lending. So it's lending to the cities, to the utility companies, and that's where we like to be. And why are we able to do that? I think we're able to do that because it comes down to this one size does not fit all. So we will look at a city and see how we can structure a bankable project. And we do that in two ways. I mean, making sure that there, in some instances, that there is a necessary contractual agreement with the city, for example, a public service contract, to make sure that if the revenues from the company are not sufficient enough, there will be a backup from the city, so that entity remains bankable. In Ukraine, we have a structure that we lend even now. We lend to the utility companies, but there is a, EBRD at the end of the day, we're a bank, we have to get our money back. And there is a municipal guarantee. In easier, I'm just, it's difficult that they're so diverse. In sort of easier areas like the Western Balkans, we would lend to a utility company, and EBRD would have what we call a municipal support agreement. So basically, we have an agreement with the city, just obligations that they will support the company, that they won't, non-interference clauses. But in some instances, as I said, in Romania, we're able to lend on the balance sheet of the company. These things take time. It's a huge amount of effort, but it's doable. And then I talked about PPPs. We are also in the urban space. It's less commonplace, I must admit, but we are able to lend to an SPV for a PPP transaction. As I said, we have done that in the 6th of October in Egypt. So that's sort of the EBRD financing. And then you've got the blended finance. It's key. I think that is what is key for EBRD to be able to do these type of transactions. So we provide grants, concessional loans, and guarantees from external parties that support that financing. And there was discussion today about the climate funds. So our main sources of funding are GCF, and we have, I don't know, how many countries do we have? 15. We have 15 countries that we have a program with GCF, and it's a lot of work, I must admit. But it's worth it, and all those comments resonated with me earlier on, as they must have done with Maya. We also have the Climate Investment Fund and the EU both for grants and increasingly guarantees. Am I running over? Because okay. So if I've run over, can I just make probably the most important points at the end? So it's another thing that enables us to work with cities is the ticket size. So EBRD, our ticket size can go from 5 million, maybe even lower, up to 250 million. So small cities, small investments. We are able to do that. We're able to go the extra mile. Also, we will tranche a loan as well. Quite often we'll go and see a risk officer and he will just say, the exposure's too much, cut it into 3. We do that a lot. And just finally, EBRD has a strong track record in municipal lending, and we have very few impaired assets, which is actually a bit of a miracle. And that means when you go and see the risk officers at EBRD, they are comfortable because of that. That's a super important point. The other is localized approach. So EBRD has opened offices in sub-Saharan Africa straight away. You need to do these type of projects, you've got to be close to the client. You've got to build that relationship. And I think at the onset, a very good understanding of the financials and constant monitoring.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for giving us insight into the inner workings of your city lending operations. And the one thing I take away, well, not the only thing, but one thing I take away is also this, like, one size does not fit all. So clearly this is something I think that when you think about city lending, that's certainly an important point to make. You need to sort of like this local contextualization here. All right, and I want to move to finally turn to Kebu, because even if lending to cities is possible, this might not be feasible to all cities and for all types of projects. So I want to ask you, Kebu, from the perspective of the DBSA, when the DBSA is lending to municipal governments in Southern and South and Southern Africa, from your perspective, what prerequisites are the cities and the projects that they want to borrow for expected to meet in order to get a loan from the DBSA?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gundula. It's really an honor to be part of this important conversation. Great insights. I've really enjoyed listening to what has been shared so far, but that clock The previous panel was right, it's quite scary. So I will try and be brief. But as the DBSA, infrastructure development is our mandate. So that is the first requirement. We focus on infrastructure development across the continent. So any form of funding that we provide is through that lens. And secondly, the infrastructure has to fall within our key sectors. So energy, bulk, water, transport, ICT, I hope I don't forget anything, social, in terms of healthcare, student accommodation, and so on. So we do not fund the likes of manufacturing, and we are not focused on acquisitions. It has to be infrastructure and it has to be developmental. We look for developmental impact. That is really key for all projects. So projects that are socially beneficial and that are aligned with our environmental and social safeguards, similar to IFC standards and IEB standards as well. And one of our key differentiators, I've spoken to a lot of people about this actually, so it excites me, and that's what I am focused on, is the fact that we offer project preparation funding. We are one of the few institutions, I think, in Africa who come in at that early stage, willing to take that risk. So the rest of the key requirements, I will split into those two: project preparation and implementation funding. For the purpose, maybe before I get to the requirements, project preparation obviously means we work alongside developers or sponsors, in this case, municipalities, to bring projects to bankability, particularly because of that conundrum that Astrid spoke about, the fact that we need development, but a lot of projects are not bankable. And you have situations where there's funding, but the funding cannot actually be committed or dispersed because the projects have not reached bankability. So we come in and we offer funding for the bankable feasibility study activities. But we do have requirements that the municipalities or the developers come at least having done a pre-feasibility study, so that the legwork has been done. There is some skin in the game. This is a project that the municipality itself is comfortable that this can work. The technology has been selected. There's a preliminary financial model, and you can see that this is something that will be able to generate some revenue and pay off the debt. Secured land, and again, I'm referencing Astrid's presentation, which was just amazing. Land is important, and land in terms of this has been secured because protocol and processes, I think really that's the biggest challenge, where you have a municipality that has perhaps earmarked a piece of land, and then a few years down the line, that land is being earmarked for something else, and you've spent money, you've allocated resources. So we need to be comfortable that the land has been secured. Offtake is obviously important. In the case of something like an energy project, where the municipality itself will be using the energy, that is easier. But for other technologies, for example, we need to know that you have secured offtake. Maybe secure is not the right word, but that there's interest. You have heads of terms or letters of interest. This is something that can be used if it's a product for outside, it's not embedded, as an example. So maybe a bit more about our funding to talk about some of the remaining key requirements. So it is a recoverable grant. Some people often ask me, okay, what does that mean? Is it not a grant? It's a grant because if the project is not bankable, we shake hands and we walk away. You do not need to pay us. So that's the grant element. But if the project becomes bankable, it gets to financial close, then we make our money there. We get paid off at financial close with a return. So it's best of both. We are DFI, but there is an element where we do need to make money because we get funding from the capital market. We are not funded by the state. So that's why it's a recoverable grant, and we need some skin in the game, as mentioned. So we need to have the municipality at least having spent something to show that this is something that has gone beyond just concept. And the preparation funding secures the right of first refusal for us to fund the debt. So that also gives you comfort that we are in it for the long run, that if we see potential in this thing, we will fund the preparation, and not just for ourselves, but we work alongside other commercial lenders and other DFIs as well. So we are in it for the long run because we are solving the problem of a lack of bankable projects in Africa. So I will be quick in terms of the implementation funding. So once the project is bankable, then we are able to hand over for the implementation financing. We provide debt. So it can be a combination of senior debt and mezzanine, as well as equity. We've recently started or established an equity offering. So there, the requirements would be similar to what we've heard before. So at that stage, the project must be bankable. So it must be technically feasible, commercially bankable. We've secured the agreements that are required to make sure that predictability of cash flows is there. And again, I've mentioned environmental and social feasibility. That's really important for us. We look for projects that have the least adverse environmental impact. So I think I'll stop there. I'll stop there for the sake of time. We can touch a bit more on the other offerings if there are questions. Thanks, Gundula.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kebo. Thank you for giving us an overview and sort of outlining how DBSA is enabling city lending for those cities that are ready to do so. But even if the right enabling environment is there, not all municipalities might be ready to borrow, and some might never be. But others could very well get there with some additional support and the right incentives. So my question to Astrid now is, could you lay out for us what the support and incentives could look like for to get cities to enable them to get to the stage where they can borrow?
So I'm just going to give two quick points. The first is, we've heard it on this panel from what Lynn has said often about EBRD's success, is that even if they work with the national government, they require the national government to on-lend to the subnational. In many cities I work with, the national government will take the loan, including my own city. Ministry of Finance will take the World Bank loan, and they will on-grant it to the city. So the city doesn't have any skin in the game and doesn't get the ability to borrow and repay, right? So I think, first of all, if you're going to take the money as a loan, even at a national government, on-lend it to your city so that the city can repay. The second thing, and again, here I'm going to talk about Kampala because this is where I'm from, but also where I did a lot of work. Between 2011 and 2015, Kampala did so many reforms under the former executive director, Jennifer Musisi, who I worked very closely with, to improve their public financial management. And they got a rating in 2015, and it was on a national scale an investable rating. But the idea is that they were going to get this rating because the national government was going to change its legislation to borrow, because Kampala at the time fell under the Local Government Act that capped borrowing for 10% of own source revenue. In 2015, the own source revenue of Kampala was about $25 million. So that we're talking about 2.5 million. That's not even worth the administrative cost of going to market. So they got the credit rating and the legislation didn't change. So what I want to say here is that we do have cities on the continent who can clean up the act and who can go there. You need to, and that's not all cities, and that's fine. But for those who can, you need to then provide some sort of graduated access to allow them then to be able to borrow, to have an incentive to be able to get the finance, to link the investments in the reforms to the actual finance at the end. Because otherwise you have cities like Kampala who then continue to draw on the national fiscus, which is very limited, and cities like Jinja, Arua, and even smaller local governments who then don't get any money, right? So, and the best example of graduated access that I've come across is in Colombia, right? Where they actually evaluate this, I think, every 3 years, and cities can fall on and borrow, but they can also fall off once they don't meet the criteria anymore, right? So that's the type of graduated access and incentives that I would say.
Great. Thank you very much, Astrid. And now, before we open up for questions from the audience, I want to ask one final question to Manja. From the perspective of the city government, what kind of support would you be looking for from the central government to facilitate your access to finance for investments? You have, let's say, a minute.
Okay. I think the most critical form of support would be the enabling legal and policy framework that allows us as a city government to raise, manage, and account for our own resources and actual devolution. There's so much talk about devolution when they're campaigning. They talk about devolution. When they come into office, it doesn't happen. It's taken back. I think that is the greatest power that we need. And I think for me, if we want stronger collaboration with national government, they need to be committed to devolution and see us as partners, whether we're opposition or not. We're partners in the development of our countries. And for me, I think that will be the key ask from Central National. I'm not sure if the Minister of Finance is here, but we need you to do this devolution, and we need you to work. We're not competing against each other. We're working with each other, and we need to demonstrate that by policy alignment and making sure that there are no overlaps. There are lots of overlaps as well, and making sure that we're clear on roles and responsibilities as well.
Thank you very much, Manja. Great. So now we have about 20 minutes left for questions from the audience. So please feel free to ask, raise your hand, and put your questions for our speakers. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
Sorry. Thank you. A question both for Kebu and Lynn. Local currency financing, are you able to finance in local currency, especially because I assume that the tenor of loans or financing has to be long term? So I'll be interested in hearing, and how, of course, your source, probably maybe less of a concern for you, Kebu, but for EBRD, sourcing local currency, of course, is an issue. And then a question for Manja, if I can. We didn't talk at all at the issue of underspending by cities. And I wonder whether you have something to share on that from Freetown.
Okay, next one was here. Yes, Joseph.
Thank you very much and for presentation. I have two issues for clarification. One is, let's start on the local spending, local borrowing, that in local, I don't know how they will be able to get concessional financing because that is domestic, likely to be at the commercial rate, which means they will not be able to repay. Secondly is the issue of on-lending, which has been mentioned. When talking of on-lending, meaning the national government take the full responsibility. It has an impact of increasing public debt and that affecting the fiscal sustainability. And some of those cities may not be able to repay. That question is, the president has said that there's a lot of money that was allocated to borrowing by the cities, but they are not able to borrow. The money is ready maybe to be voted back. The issue is, how is the DFI redefining or redesigning how they can be able to rate those counties, and understanding the problem and be able to assist them to get the money. Otherwise, it remains an issue where there's money allocated for them to borrow and they're not able to borrow. Then they require a rethinking on how that money, so the DFI maybe they can explain how is it now redesigning or coming, relaxing the rules that they're able to borrow the money.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. My name is Mohammed. I'm from Somalia, and thank you for the presentation and great insights and interventions. Very, very interesting. I just wanted to know from my own experience, of course, I live in one of the fastest growing cities now, most of it unplanned. And according to the World Bank, the urban growth rate is about 4.3%. Which is huge, is amongst the biggest in the globally. And currently about 47% of the population, about 8.8 million live in urban cities. So it's quite challenging issues. And this rapid urbanization is mainly forced by conflict and climate change, including environmental disasters, loss of land access, and sometimes food insecurity. So what I was really wanting to know is, and I think Ipuse briefly mentioned, that we have a huge problem when it comes to land ownership and land management, because municipalities can be increasingly unpredictable. Because of land disputes, sometimes everything is being run down, and the private sector is very heavily involved. Is there any examples that you've seen in different countries when it comes to private sector investment, PPP, legalities, land dispute, etc.? And where does that lead us to? For example, in the context of, poor countries, and especially countries that are emerging from conflict, for example. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. And then I think Yemeni, this way.
Thank you. That was a really insightful set of presentations. I was just curious, Maja, when you impose property tax, what kind of reaction did you get from your voters? Because in India, one of the big pushbacks from local governments for imposing taxation or deploying their taxation powers is the claim that it's politically unviable to get re-elected after you start taxing. So curious what happened in your case.
Thank you. I think we're gonna let the panel respond first, but then we take a second round of questions. So just remember them. So who would like to start? Would you like to start? Maybe Kipu?
Yes, no, that's fine. Thank you for the questions. In terms of the local currency, of course, in South Africa, it's easier because we can lend in rands. But for example, Zambia, Zimbabwe, dollars. So unfortunately, it is a challenge. We mostly in the continent, it has to be in hard currency. That is that. In terms of on lending and the ability to borrow, so unfortunately, because of time, couldn't go into a lot of detail around how we structure our funding. So we prefer ring fencing mechanisms. I wanted to go into a bit more detail around policies and interventions that can help municipal borrowing. And we spoke a lot about private sector participation, but we usually lend into the SPV, the special purpose vehicle, in the form of project finance. So even if it's direct lending to municipalities, sometimes it's not project finance, but it identifies the infrastructure that will come out of that funding. So in that case, yes, it is lending directly to the municipality. But when we look at our portfolio, a lot of it really is project finance. That is the question. And then on land, we could have another session just on land, because this is really a big one. For private projects, it is easier because you find that these are sponsors who own the land, or they have an option to lease or purchase agreement. In terms of municipal land, I think we are lucky in South Africa that there is a process for getting access to municipal land, where it is clear for the private sector what needs to happen to get the rights of use of the land. But the process is long, it is lengthy. And sometimes you find that by the time that signature is in place, some of the feasibility studies need to be redone, some of the elements of the feasibility study. So in terms of processes, they are there. It's just the timing thereof that is really a problem. But we have seen that a lot of projects, private sector has been able to get access to the land. I don't know if I forgot anything, but maybe let me give the rest of my.
Yes, Lynn, if you want to just take any questions that you would like to respond to, leave the ones you don't.
On the local currency lending, yes, EBRD can do local currency lending. And I think just looking at the projects where we're very active in green cities, it's Morocco and Kazakhstan. But we are hitting a bit of an issue, because in those countries, we would like to use the funding that we have from GCF, from the Green Climate Fund, which is concessional loans. And GCF we have to lend in US dollars or euros, and that is, I must say, that is a hindrance. I think on lending, it's clear with EBRD, we want to be at the city level with the utility company or with the SPV. That's our place. And yes, on the so what I've noticed as we sort of start to go into sub-Saharan Africa, I've been in a lot of discussions about big urban schemes, regeneration of railway stations, and it's not it's very difficult. It's not somewhere where we have traditionally been in the urban space, but I think we're going to be there, and I think we'll have a lot of lessons to learn. Yeah, and on the properties, on the property side and the land disputes, I mean, how long have you got? I think I can just as one project that resonates with me, because we spent so much money on technical assistance to prepare a project. I think it was in Tirana for a bus station, and just ownership rights came up and we just gave up, but only after the bank or a donor spent an awful lot of money.
Thank you, Lynn. Manja, I think there were a few questions that were directly directed at you.
I'll answer the last one first. Reaction from residents on the property tax. I mean, I told you initially the government stopped us from actually collecting tax. So that created a lot of confusion. But I think for us, it was the first thing we did. So if you as a government are going to do something radical, do it early, because they forget. In terms of underspend by city government, that's more of a gray area. We want more money. There are so many projects that I have lined up. Like if they're financiers here, I have projects for you. So it's not a matter of not having money, but sometimes we need national government concurrence. So we have 2 dump sites, and we wanted to get a landfill. We negotiated with World Bank and the national government, and the national government was supposed to provide the land. 3 years later, they didn't provide the land. $20 million was taken back. And this is just unfortunate because the money was there. So that for us, that's an underspend, because it's money that was available that we could have used. And because we couldn't identify land to do a landfill, we couldn't do it. But then I think just internally, there's also bureaucracy. The mayor comes from private sector. I have a private sector background. I run the delivery unit. We're like, psh, psh, psh. And at government level, the bureaucracy, it's like, oh my goodness, we need to move, we need to go. The mayor has just 5 years, we need to deliver. But you have, there are ways of doing things. Procurement takes a long time, emails don't get responded to on time. And so there are a lot of times when we've been at risk. But because we have really good relationships also with our funders, they'll flag it up and would have to kind of nudge people along. But I think there needs to be a lot of capacity building at local government level to get the staff that's needed. We're talking about creditworthiness. We're talking about building institutions that will be able to get loans, to attract investment. You need to make sure that we have people in these institutions that know what they're doing. And I think for me, that is critical. And that's a conversation that we're not really having for local governments or national government.
Right. Thank you, Manja. Astrid, anything you want to add to this?
I just add to 2 questions. So one, after that, we did that report for the AFDB. This summer, the AFDB asked me to do like a much more in-depth review of the subnational finance guidelines. And so I interviewed a lot of internal officers at the AFDB and unpacked the guidelines. And I think to redesigning the system, I think the system in the AFDB exists on paper, but when you talk to credit risk officers and everything who work on they actually don't know how to work with cities. And the perception is cities are risky. And so Lynn's experience with actually lending and being paid, that doesn't exist yet. And so the perception issue is really difficult to overcome. The second thing is, the big thing with the AFDB that's different from the EBRD and now also the IDB is that they haven't got the instruments to do that local currency, right? Except for in Rand or in the CEFA zones where it's pegged to the euro, right? So that's the other big problem. on the property tax, not to speak to well, I want to speak to Freetown because I think there's one part of Freetown that when I use this case study, I always emphasize. I work on a lot of property tax reform. It is really difficult because people don't want to pay. And it's also a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? We're getting terrible local services. Why should we pay our property tax? But you can't improve the property tax, right? I think the key thing that Freetown did, and Manja mentioned it in her first one, is they actually started with the plan. They started with getting buy-in to a credible plan, not just credible to external investors, but credible to the citizens. And then they said to the citizens, great, now we've come up with this plan together. This plan needs money. And that to me is really key. So you have to rebuild the social contract. And I think this is what Freetown did, like, or Mayor Akisori did so well, which is she didn't start with saying, give us more money, give us more money, give us more money. And that's a pitfall I see in a lot of property tax reform. It started with, what's our vision for the city? Where are the investments that are needed? Let's all come together and do this together. And then how are we going to finance this? And I think that's really critical in the Freetown example, from my opinion.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Astrid. Now, a second round of questions. It's going to be a short one, but I will do my best. So we have Sam here and Ed.
There you go.
You go.
Thank you so much, Astrid. That was excellent presentation on the panel. I have three observations and probably they can turn into questions to me. Number one is about our tax policies, the way you talk. Don't you think the tax policies that we have really, like in Uganda, and the centralized tax system affects the way local governments and cities can be able to generate funds? What can we do is the question. Number two is, there are very few free towns on the continent and elsewhere where governance is that good. And my thinking is the governance of the city is key in terms of how to raise financing. For me, that's what can we do? Should we start by really looking at governance and making it better so cities can be able to get money in form of taxation, domestic, but also go to the getting loans? And that takes me to the loan aspect. 10 cities in Uganda plus Kampala and Authority. If we allowed all of them to get loans, what would happen to our debt portfolio? How would we control it? For me, that's what is ringing in my head. 15 years ago, if you know Astrid, you must be knowing local governments were borrowing money, and they could even borrow like 100,000 USDs, and they were building and buying cars, mortgaging government assets, and we had to come in. So isn't this going to come? How do we control it? That's why those resolutions are there. Probably we need to think deeply into that, but the fact is we need financing for these cities. I thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you. Just a quick observation and a question on the capital budget under execution point. I mean, this is something that we see an awful lot in the IMF, both at the national government level and at subnational government. But a lot of the time, it actually has its roots in unrealistic budgeting as much as poor outturns on capital. But it's a really pernicious problem because when spending agencies enter into commitments based on what's in the budget, when the revenue doesn't materialize, but there's weak commitment controls, you end up very quickly in a situation with expenditure arrears, project delays, and very often project abandonment. And obviously in a capital project, you don't get anything until the whole thing is complete. So it's a big issue. So I just wonder if your views on that. And secondly, Astrid, you mentioned as well about, and I think another of the panelists mentioned procurement. Sometimes in our experience, the project preparation phase is a little disjointed. And the first element of it is thinking about feasibility and the economic and strategic case for the project, but with insufficient engagement on what actually happens in implementation, and how do you have more of a continuum of project preparation in order that when those incremental decisions are taken to approve the project, that actually there's a lot more readiness and a lot more that the pipeline process actually kicks in and there's more readiness to implement. So I just wonder your views on that, and whether we need to change a little bit how we think about front-end project appraisal and preparation to engage a little more with what happens post-approval.
Great. Thank you. All right, I think we'll leave the questions at that, and I'll hand over to the panelists to give their last comments on the questions. Maybe just a minute per person, if that's possible. Astrid, do you want to start?
So yes, I can pick up also a lot of the Uganda-specific questions with Sam directly, but I just want to emphasize the point. I don't think all our cities, I've worked with a lot of those 10 cities, I don't think they should all be borrowing, right? But what I do think is the ones that should be borrowing should be allowed to borrow so that as a Ministry of Finance, you can concentrate on the other cities, right? And that's the difference. But yes, the re-centralization thing, I absolutely think it's a problem. But that's a trend that we see across Africa at the moment, re-centralization of finance. To your point, Ed, this is where I work a lot with cities directly, and the TA that's provided to cities is increasingly on the project phase because it is a visible outcome. I really advocate for TA in the sort of grunt, like procurement and realistic budgeting. And here is where I do give kudos to the IFIs very much so, because they're the ones who tend to take that on, but they're now working less and less in that space at a city level. They're working, but like, how can you just get your systems working? Like, how can you help cities budget realistically is absolutely key. Yeah.
For me, I think it speaks to just what I said, the last thing I said about the capacity gaps within city government. You go to a lot of these conferences, you hear from speakers after speakers, it's at the national level. When you talk about opportunities, engagement, understanding the complexities of how cities and local government and national government engage, you don't find cities in these conversations. So it's really difficult for them to even imagine what some of these collaborations could look like, because oftentimes they're not in the room. And so I think that there needs to be a lot more work done to ensure that cities are in the room, in the conversations, and are part of the decisions and part of the conversations, so that they're able to really imagine and have a bigger vision. You know, in Freetown, we always say Mayor Akisora has audacity. Like, why would you come to West Africa, 1.2 million, if you want to do a cable car? Because she's been in spaces where that's possible. She's seen it. And we need to be able to show other African cities and other African leaders what the possibilities are. And that's only when we can begin to really drive the change. And these projects that we're talking about, these big projects, it can only come when they're exposed to what these possibilities are and what other people are doing.
I mean, just to comment on the project implementation, I mean, as Astrid has said, that's what MDBs are for, and we just follow the product right the way through from feasibility to implementation. You know, it's all about the program that I lead. It delivers investments. That's why it's successful.
Thank you. I think I also wanted to comment on the planning. I laughed yesterday, I think, when Shakira was talking about planning, but if I had to make a recommendation on interventions, it's really that support for infrastructure master planning to create a pipeline of projects, a comprehensive pipeline of projects at a municipal level. And this is one of, I mean, this is not punting DBSA, but we actually offer a grant from our profits to municipalities that are under-resourced and deserving for master planning support, because I think it creates a path for private sector to know where to get involved and where to get involved and when they would likely get involved. And it's a holistic approach because we also have an implementing arm. So we don't just plan and prepare, fund, and then off you go. For municipalities that require that service, there's also implementation where we are the agent and we see through to construction. So I think DFIs and other institutions, a holistic approach is important from beginning to end, because somewhere along the way, if you capacitate one arm, then there you go. You have fruitless expenditure because the project goes nowhere, because you didn't take care of the other. That's my final comment. Thank
Excellent.
you.
I'm sorry. So as I'm sitting here and I'm just reflecting, when you want investment, when you want someone to invest in you, you market yourself. And we are really good at marketing ourselves in Freetown. We market ourselves, we put ourselves out there, and as a result, people want to work with us. They come to us. How can I work with Freetown? How do we get you as partners? And I think that's really important for cities to also understand that it's how you put yourself out, how you position yourself, and that's also been one of our biggest game changers. Is how we put ourselves out there and tell our story, and people want to be a part of the story.
On that note, we're 5 minutes over. So thank you very much. Yes. Thank you for your thoughtful questions, and a big thank you to the fantastic panelists we've had. I think we're all ready for lunch now. We have about an hour at this point. So please join us outside for some sustenance. Thank you.